Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Herald's political podcast, Unspun Live. I'm Hannah Brown, our political correspondent, and I'm joined by my fellow political correspondent, Kathleen Nutt. How you doing, Kathleen?
Very well, thank you, Hannah.
Good. And we're recording this on Monday, June the 16th. A couple of days ago, it was the Scottish Conservative Conference in Edinburgh's Murrayfield Stadium. And there was quite a dark cloud hanging over the Scottish Tories before coming into this conference. Isn't that right, Kathleen? It was quite a difficult time.
Yes, the conference had happened or took place just a week or so after the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election, where the Tories came fourth with a really poor result, I think just 6% of support, and they narrowly managed to hold on to their deposit. So that was a big shock for them, and polls have also suggested that the Conservatives could come fourth in the Holyrood election next year, with Reform perhaps becoming the main opposition parties. So there has been a lot of analysis, I think, by the Tories of why this is happening to them, why are they in such a poor position. That analysis seems to be saying it's the fault of what happened with the previous UK government, with scandals around Partygate and Boris Johnson, and then Liz Truss's budget, and the fallout from that has weakened the Tories considerably in Scotland too. As far as I can see it, that's part of the story. I think the main part of the story they don't want to really be talking about, the Conservatives at the moment, is the threat that Reform poses to them, because Reform is another a centrist party, more populist than the Conservatives. So the Conservatives have got to come up with something which distinguishes themselves from Reform and give people a reason to vote for them rather than Reform. And I'm not entirely sure if they're doing that at the moment.
I think we'll hear very soon from Andrew Bowie, who's on the podcast. He's been speaking to our political editor, Andrew Learmonth, and the way that Andrew Bowie kind of worded it in this interview is that the Tories have got to beat Reform in the battle of ideas. You know, he looked at how the Scottish Tories shouldn't be dwelling on the past. Yes, they've made mistakes. They've accepted that through Liz Truss, through Boris Johnson. You know, he even described it as the chaos. But now the party really needs to be looking forward. Myself and Rebecca McCurdy, fellow political correspondent, were both at the Scottish Conservative Conference, and we actually thought that the mood was fairly upbeat from the membership. They were quite looking forward. I mean, I don't think it was wholly positive. I think there's a lot of brave faces going on there, but the message from both the UK Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, and the Scottish Conservative leader, Russell Finlay, was that we need to focus on renewal and a refreshed Conservative vision. You know, Kemi Badenoch said on Friday, our party is under new management. We're looking at going forward. I even spoke to the health spokesperson for the Scottish Conservatives, Dr. Sandish Gohani, and he had all these plans for a new approach to the NHS. You know, he was talking about creating a Scottish first approach with GPs who are trained in Scotland getting first priority. So GP students or medic students in Scotland getting first priority to training schemes. He also spoke about a 7-day-a-week GP-led service being put in place if the Tories were to come into government. So he's clearly trying to take on this refreshed and renewed approach that Bowie, Finlay and Badenoch are focusing on, which will be quite interesting to see how that bodes well with voters, given, you know, we see the historically high NHS waiting times. It's a huge issue for John Swinney. So if the Conservatives, in this respect at least, can offer a renewed and refreshed vision, it potentially might win over some voters.
Yes, it could win over some voters by chipping away at the Scottish Government's record, but I think they still need a bigger vision.
So let's hear what Andrew Bowie, the Conservative MP, had to say to our political editor, Andrew Learmonth.
Do you enjoy conference as a Tory MP? Do you enjoy going to conference?
See, honestly, Andrew, I absolutely love conference. The Scottish Conservative Party to me is it's like a family, and so suppose Scottish Conference could be looked at as sort of Christmas, because it's the one time that everybody from across the country all gathers together in one place, and you catch up with people you haven't seen in, well, since the previous year's conference, and you know, it doesn't really matter what the polls are saying or where we find ourselves, either in government or in opposition, or what the situation is at Holyrood on any given year. It is the one occasion where we all gather in the same place to debate, discuss, talk to each other about, you know, what best we can do to continue moving the party forward.
Just looking back at last year's conference, so it was March last year, wasn't it? Is that right? I think,
Yeah.
Or and just how much has changed since then. You know, the fact you've got a new Scottish leader and a new UK leader, and the fact that you're no longer in government. Probably the biggest change, the fact that you're no longer in government. I mean, what is the mood going to be like at conference when you go into it? Given all
honestly,
that.
Like the mood at conference it never really reflects reality. I mean, the conferences are always upbeat because it is the one point of the year where every Conservative in the country is invited to gather together. And as I said, it's a collection of old friends and colleagues, and despite the serious nature of conferences, i.e. developing policy, engaging with each other to think about how we can go out and sell the Conservative Party afresh to a sceptical public, the mood will be good. I've no doubt about that. It's good at UK conferences and Scottish conferences, despite whatever the prevailing winds might be that we might be facing. In terms of, you know, where we find ourselves, yeah, absolutely right. Huge changes in the course of just 1 year. And actually, when you look at politics in general, I mean, the hugely volatile nature of our politics right now, we went from having our best election result in a UK context since 1987, that was in 2019, to having our worst result in over 200 years in the space of just 5 years. So there have obviously been huge changes, and they continue to change. I mean, I don't think even 6 months ago people would have predicted reform coming second in a Scottish parliamentary by-election. I don't think 2 weeks ago people would be predicting Labour winning a Scottish parliamentary by-election. So things move and change incredibly quickly, and we have to be able to deal with that. I think that's one of the challenges we've got. I think we came into opposition, you know, very much of the view, and I think rightly, that we would have and need the time and the space to develop the policies, to reset our relationship with the British people and really renew who we are as a party. Now, that work is really important and has to continue. But the fast-paced nature right now, the incredibly fast-paced nature of politics right now demands that we react far quicker than maybe we were prepared to when we first came into opposition, and that requires change, and that's what's going on right now. Hence why you're seeing far more in terms of, well, you will be seeing far more in terms of policy announcements and the direction of travel that Kemi wants to take us on in a UK context, building through to next year, and then of course to the general election in 2029.
I was struck by Kemi's her letter to members at the start of the handbook, her introduction to the handbook for the Scottish Tory Conference this weekend, where she talks about mistakes being made, and I've seen that quite a lot recently from Tory MPs. I think Kemi said something about it before as well. I mean, how important is it for you to have that level of contrition, I suppose, with the public?
I mean, we do need to apologise for the mistakes that were made, but we also need to know when to draw a line under that, right, and move on. I think the whole sackcloth and ashes approach, the self-flagellation and the mea culpa has its place, but I think that we're coming to the point now where we need to sort of turn the page and move forward. We need to say, right, okay, that was then. Mistakes were made, but this is what we're going to do in the future. This is our optimistic, forward-looking vision for the United Kingdom in the 2030s, and I think this time to start doing that is now. I think people want to hear from us. What is the alternative to this Labour government? What is the alternative in Scotland to the Scottish National Party? Frankly, what is the alternative to a sort of centre-left dominated politics in Scotland ever since the creation of the Scottish Parliament? I mean, you may or may not be a Conservative supporter, but frankly, I do think there's a mood in Scotland right now that things are not working as well as they could, and that things need to change. And we've seen sort of since devolution, the dominance of sort of a single train of thought when it comes to political ideology and approach to doing government. Okay, the constitution is separate, obviously, but from Labour, the Lib Dems, and the SNP, sort of, and the Greens, a sort of a dominant left-wing approach to governance and civil society. And I do think that maybe that Scotland is ripe for a change. We need to be the ones making that case, not reform, because I don't believe reform can adequately or realistically bring about the change that is required. And we also need to be able to do that in a UK context as well.
In terms of convincing voters, though, I suppose you're struggling a bit to convince them it is you that's going to make that change rather than reform going to make that change. As you said, at the by-election last week, we saw them come third with 26% of the vote, which is, a highest vote share in any Scottish by-election. You guys went from 17% to about 6%. I mean, first of all, how do you tackle reform? How do you convince people that you're the party that makes a change and not reform? Because you're not making that argument just yet.
If I had the silver bullet, or if I had the answer to that, Andrew, I'd be a very wealthy man indeed. Look, countries across the world are struggling with the rise of populist politics, right? We see that in France, Germany, Sweden. We see that in the United States of America. All across the developed world, populist parties, populist politicians are tapping into an undercurrent of disenchantment with the establishment, with the established parties. And across the West, indeed, any incumbent government that oversaw the COVID pandemic has suffered serious losses in the subsequent elections that have followed, because society was deeply affected by that in ways I don't think we've really examined. The economies of all of these countries were deeply damaged by the necessary actions that we had to take to keep this country afloat. Furlough, for example, and so there's deep disenchantment about governance because people don't feel better off than they did 5 years ago. There's mitigating reasons for that, but they don't, and we took the hit. So I think we're not unique as a party in having to face a reform or whoever the equivalent might be in other countries. And I think what we need to do is beat them in the battle of ideas. We need to say, right, okay, fine. That's all well and good. Your simple solutions to incredibly complex problems may sound great on the doorstep or in a 20-second TikTok video, but actually, how are you going to deal with the deep-rooted problems that we face as a country? How are you going to promote growth in this country? What are you going to do to create the jobs of the future here in the United Kingdom? If you do want to reduce the size and the cost of doing government, as all good Conservatives should, how are you going to do that while saying that you want to nationalise certain industries up and down the country or expand the size of the state in parts of the country, which is what Nigel Farage is saying in the constituencies where he knows that plays well. He's saying something very, very different to a different audience in the southeast of England, for example. So it's incredibly difficult. There is no simple solution to that, but it starts with winning the battle of ideas, which is one of the reasons that Kemi sort of tasked all of her shadow cabinet with going out and doing this policy renewal process, which is lengthy and time consuming and people will not see the full results of that for a few months at least, but it is necessary, because when we go out to the public, we have a responsibility as an aspiring party of government to have done the hard work, have done interrogated the evidence, developed the policies so that it stands the test of time, stands the scrutiny of the electorate, and therefore will hopefully stand up in an argument when we're coming to win back those voters who quite clearly are leaving us, not just to reform, but to other parties as well.
It's not just reform that you're up against really in the next Holland election, next year's election. For what Ruth Davidson did very well, and what Douglas Ross did reasonably well as well, was convince voters that if you wanted to vote against independence or say no to independence, then you voted for the Scottish Conservatives. And so you squeezed Labour with that message, and it worked. It was very successful for you. But we're now seeing a resurgent Labour Party. I mean, how are you going to convince voters that you are the party of the union, or that you need to vote Conservative to save the union?
I don't think any other party has quite as vociferously demonstrated that we are the only genuine unionist party in Scotland. I mean, Anna Sarwar talks the talk. But frankly, up until the last Scottish parliamentary election, there were Labour MSPs who flirted with the idea of a second independence referendum. We know that Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party down here, was also inclined to give another Scottish referendum should the time come and should it be requested of him. The Liberal Democrats want to move down a fully federal route for the UK. I think that would further weaken the bonds that keep the United Kingdom entire and whole. And Nigel Farage has said that he doesn't think there's anything much wrong with John Swinney remaining in Bute House after that Scottish election. So no, and no. The Scottish Conservatives don't want any more powers to the Scottish Parliament. We want to, strengthen the bonds that keep the United Kingdom together. If you have flirted with independence in the past or think that another referendum is a good idea, you will not be standing as a candidate for the Scottish Conservative and Unionists. And we think that the very worst thing for Scotland is 5 more years of SNP governance or John Swinney remaining in Bute House. So that quite clearly, we are the strongest unionist party. We're the only party with unionist in its name. That part of our name is sometimes forgotten in a UK context, but is incredibly important to who we are, because we do believe in the concept of one nation. Yes, 4 nations, but as one nation moving forward together. And that is something which is going to be at the heart of everything that we're doing in a Scottish context and as a wider UK party moving forward up and until the next election and beyond. And I think if we can make that argument in the parts of the country where we are strong and have been strong in the past, and we can maintain that electoral coalition of support from people who do not want to see the Scottish National Party remain in government, nor want to see or have any truck with the prospects of another independence referendum. So the old campaign slogan of 2016, 17, 19, 21 and 24 is absolutely true. If you don't want a Scottish independence referendum, you have to vote for the Scottish Conservatives.
And you find the argument is still compelling on the doorstep. People are still sort of, given where independence is just now, or given where the SNP are and the likelihood of an independence referendum in the next few years, is that argument still working for you? Is it still compelling?
We need to have more than just that. I mean, we did there's an argument that argument has run its course, but it still remains. It's still a fact, and so we'll still be saying it because it is a fact. The only party that guarantees there will not be another Scottish independence referendum, should we be elected to either Holyrood or back in Westminster, is the Conservative Party. But we need to have much more alongside that. So we're going to be offering people a vision of what a Scotland under a Conservative government in Edinburgh will look like, and indeed in the wider UK context, what a renewed, refreshed Conservative vision for the future will mean for the country. And we're going to be saying a lot more about that, certainly in a Scottish context, over the next few days at the Scottish Conference. Because if you look at the record, whilst, yes, the union is absolutely front and centre and at the core of who we are as a party, when you look at the record in the Scottish Parliament, be that on gender recognition, deposit return schemes, standing up for our farmers, standing up for our oil and gas industry, standing up for rural communities who feel under threat at the minute through, be that the industrialisation of new energy projects, or indeed some of the madcap Patrick Harvey schemes to decarbonise by asking them to get rid of their boilers or their wood burners, whatever it might be. Only the Conservatives in Scotland have actually been on the side of the majority of the Scottish people. So the key task for us is to take that broad agreement with what we've been saying and turn that into votes. That's a huge challenge, but it's a challenge that I know that Russell's definitely up for, and I'm certainly there with him.
You talked earlier about sort of, you really don't want John Swinney to be in power for the next 5 years after the next election. You really want to stop that. One of those sort of maybe a bit of a thought experiment, but had Reform's votes and the Tories' votes at the Hamilton by-election gone together, then you would have had more votes than Labour. I mean, could you be in a position? Do you think there will be in a position, given that Kemi has said there could be some agreements or cooperation between Reform and the Tories and councils south of the border? Do you think there could ever be a sort of Scottish Tory Reform UK agreement, working partnership, House agreement even?
Absolutely not. It's there's very, very different contexts, individual councils doing deals to get policies or decisions across the line in a local authority context. We were in coalition with Liberal Democrats, for example, in Aberdeenshire. We were in coalition with the Labour Party in Aberdeen up until the last local authority election, and we've been in coalition with various parties across the country in a local government context for many, many years in order to ensure the continued governance and accountability of those local authorities and delivery of essential services, frankly, for the people that need them. When it comes to a Scottish parliamentary context or a UK context, my view is that the very worst thing we could possibly do would be to countenance an agreement or a coalition style deal with Reform. Reform are not a Conservative party, they're a populist party, they're not a unionist party, and they're not a serious party. They're offering simple solutions to incredibly complex issues. You've got a leader who has said that his main aim is the destruction of the Conservative Party. We're a party of over 200 years history and experience in government. We're a party that's serious about returning to office in 4 years' time. We're a party that thinks deeply and cares passionately about the issues facing this country and the future of this country. And for all those reasons and more, I cannot countenance a time when we would be relying on Reform UK to ensure the continued survival of this party, or indeed to project us back into government. It could be I frankly think it would be the very worst thing that we could do as a party, and would undermine all of the other things that we've done, and indeed damage the electoral coalition, which we desperately need to regain should we be lucky enough to win power back at a Westminster context, certainly. Because let's not forget, in 2015, we won that first majority since 1992. A lot of those seats came at the expense of Liberal Democrat MPs. So we've got to be cognizant of that fact as well.
So at the start of this conversation, you said the party conference was a bit like Christmas, and everyone gets together for the first time. Everyone's in the same place. Christmas, I don't know what Christmas is like in your household, but Christmas in my household, there's often arguments and there's often disagreements, and sometimes it's quite nice just to get to the end of the festive season and go home. In terms of the party, the party has had its internal battles over the years. Do you feel that under Kemi, under Russell, things are better, that you're more unified than you have been?
Oh, absolutely far better. And I also said that the Scottish Conservative Party was like a family, and you don't always agree on everything with your family. And like Christmas, whilst it's always great to see them, it's always quite nice at the end of the day to see them go home as well. So look, it is of course there's disagreements, of course there's discussion, and sometimes passions are become inflamed because we're talking about something which we deeply care about, and that's the future of our country. And as Conservatives and Unionists, we're very proud of our country, our countries, in fact, Scotland and Great Britain, and we want to see the way through to the future. And I'm quite proud of the fact that a lot of the discussion that we have as a party is held in the open. We don't have any secrets. We do those arguments are held in full public view. Unlike the Scottish National Party, we don't preclude our members of Parliament from taking a different view on an issue to another and being able to express that publicly, but of course within reason. That's a healthy thing for a democracy. I think it's good for people to see that within the organisations that are seeking their approval to govern, there's agreement, discussion, and challenge within those organisations. So yeah, of course that happens. Now, there's a difference between that and the utter chaos that we saw with the multiple changes of leader at a UK level, and the lurching from one policy on Brexit to another, and the failure to get the government's agenda across the line, especially in the days of Theresa May. That is not healthy. That is not helpful. And members of Parliament have got a duty to yes, disagree, yes, debate, but also remember that they are charged with governing this country in a sensible and managed manner. And frankly, we lost that during the last election. So, during the last Parliament. So, yes, things are far improved. Now, under Kemi's leadership, there is, far less open or bitter disagreement anyway. And I think in a Scottish parliamentary context, we're all united and facing the same direction, that we want to seek to grow the number of members of the Scottish Parliament. Scottish Conservative members of the Scottish Parliament at the next election, and we want to see an end to Scottish National Party dominance of Scottish politics.
So we heard from Andrew Bowie just there, the Conservative MP. He mentioned that the party needs to have more than just opposition to Indy to make sure that they stand a fighting chance at the next elections. Kathleen and I spoke about this ahead of a speech John Swinney will give tomorrow, where he is expected to amp up his calls for Scottish independence.
What actually ironically could go in their favour is if the SNP and John Swinney put more of a focus on independence in the ahead of the election. There hasn't really been a strong focus on independence over the past year or so since John Swinney came into power, and so much so that Nicola Sturgeon said in January that independence was now off the radar, and John Swinney has suggested that the support for independence would need to reach up to high 60% before there is a sort of an absolute case for getting a second independence referendum. So, but tomorrow John Swinney is going to be making a speech on independence. We haven't got the details yet of what is likely to be in the speech, but I would imagine that he will be saying something like the SNP's position is that it's only as an independent country can Scotland reach its full potential and in terms of the economic situation and improving public services as well, perhaps to their maximum. So I think that's interesting. Also, from a sort of looking at it from an SNP point of view as well, it's interesting that John Swinney is giving a speech on independence a week or so after the party's defeat in the by-election in Hamilton and Larkhall and Stonehouse. The SNP were expected to win that seat, but came second to Labour, and there have been certain murmurings about whether John Swinney is now safe as SNP leader and First Minister.
As you know,
we had a story,
Andrew
Learmonth, our political editor, had a story last week saying there was a meeting of rebels who had given John Swinney 2 weeks to come up with a plan, and a new independence plan, or face a leadership challenge at the party's conference potentially in October. People I've been speaking to in Holyrood don't actually think there will be a leadership challenge, or certainly a serious leadership challenge from, say, another government minister or senior figure in the party, and believe it wouldn't be the sensible thing to do, less than a year away from a Holyrood election. Other people in the SNP are saying, yes, we lost Hamilton by-election, but figures from polling guru John Curtis has said that extrapolating those figures out to the Holyrood election, the figures from the result of the Hamilton by-election onto what would happen at the Holyrood election, is that the SNP would win, would lose seats, but would still be the biggest party with something like 48, and people are saying, they would probably govern as a minority, because people wouldn't want necessarily to work with reform. So the SNP could govern as a minority with maybe some support from the Scottish Greens as well on issues. So it's a really interesting time. Will we hear more about independence coming from the SNP? I think probably we will do. I'm not entirely sure what the plan will be, because they've really got to have a referendum in order to have a legally binding result, and the UK government is saying they're not going to grant one. Keir Starmer said earlier this month that he saw no situation where that would happen, an independence referendum would happen while he was Prime Minister. So I don't think the independence movement is going to be moving that far ahead over the next 5 years, really.
It all depends, and I think tomorrow we'll hear a wee bit more about what those plans are exactly when it comes to the SNP and their focus on independence, potentially welcomed by the Scottish Conservatives, who want to be seen as the viable opposition to Indy 2.0. So yes, we'll have all the latest lines.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, Hannah, because I think Ruth Davidson did really well for the Conservatives by positioning the Conservatives as the main party opposed to independence, and she very cleverly positioned the Conservatives in that way, in which, and they then became the main opposition at Holyrood through that positioning. Will Russell Finlay be able to do that again? Well, time will tell, but we'll see in the next few months.
Exactly, because it worked out so well for her. Yes, so we will keep you up to date with all the latest goings on heraldscotland.com, online and in print. That is all we've got time for on the Unspun live podcast, but please do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts from, and we'll be back with you next week.